So we're on part 2, chapter 2, section 4 of On the Mode of Existence of Technical Objects. So section 4, the title is Philosophical Thought Must Carry Out the Integration of Technical Reality into Universal Culture by Founding a Technology. And just a quick note or reminder before we get into the text. So here he's using the word technology as he has throughout the text, as meaning the science or the study of technical reality. So technology is not what is studied, but it's the study itself. And then he uses techniques to describe what is studied, the object of study of technology. Okay, so I'll get into the text now. The advent of the conditions allowing man to see the technical relation functioning in an objective way is the prime condition for the incorporation of the knowledge of technical reality and of the values implied by its existence into culture. Now, these conditions are realized in the technical ensembles employing machines that have a sufficient degree of indeterminacy. For man, the action of having to intervene as a mediator in this relation between machines grants him a situation of independence in which he can acquire a cultural vision of technical realities. The engagement in the asymmetrical relation with a single machine cannot provide the necessary distance for what one might call technical wisdom. Only a situation in which there is a concrete link with machines and responsibility towards them, but which is liberated vis-a-vis each one taken individually, can provide this serenity of having technical awareness. Just as literary culture, in order to constitute itself, needed the wise individuals who had lived and contemplated the interhuman relation with a certain distance that gave them a serenity and depth of judgment, while nevertheless maintaining an intense presence among human beings. Technical culture cannot constitute itself without developing a certain sort of wisdom, which we will call technical wisdom, in men who feel their responsibility toward technical realities, but who remain disengaged from the immediate and exclusive relationship with a particular technical object. It is rather difficult for a worker to know technicity through the aspects and modalities of his daily work on a machine. It is also difficult for a man who is the owner of machines and who considers them productive capital to know their essential technicity. It is the mediator of the relation between machines alone who can discover this particular form of wisdom. Such a function, however, does not yet have a social place. It would be that of the production planning engineer if he wasn't preoccupied by immediate output and governed by a finality external to the operating system, régime, of machines, which is that of productivity. The function whose basic lines we are attempting to draw would be that of a psychologist of machines, or of a sociologist of machines, what we might call a mechanologist. So he's bringing back in some of the themes that he introduced in the introduction to the whole work about the different types of relations to technical reality and which social roles allow for knowledge of technical reality. And so he argues that the sort of two most recognized social roles of relation to a machine, which are the worker who operates a machine and then the owner of the machine. Those two roles, neither one provides an opportunity for proper knowledge of the machine. So the worker has this asymmetrical relationship to the machine in the sense that they only view the machine as a sort of black box that has a certain type of functioning that we saw this in the last section last week. So the machine does a certain thing when you press this set of buttons or whatever operation, but the worker doesn't need to actually understand the functioning of the machine itself. And likewise, the owner of the machine just knows that if I spend X dollars on the machine and raw materials and so on, then I'll get a product that I can sell for Y dollars. And the actual functioning of the machine is sort of a black box that is not really, the owner doesn't need to know that in order to have an economic understanding of the operating of the machine. So then the position that Simondon is sort of calling for or pointing towards is something that doesn't yet exist or doesn't really have a recognized social standing, but it would be something like he calls it the sociologist of machines. So someone who would understand machines in relation to each other and understand those relations without sort of blackboxing the machine, and without so the functioning of the machine itself would be what is studied rather than sort of its economic output or something along those lines.
The word wisdom is interesting. When he says, see, technical culture cannot constitute itself without developing a certain sort of wisdom, which we'll call technical wisdom. So I find it useful to point out from time to time the connections between this work and the individuation book. And I find another reference to an idea of wisdom in that book. And he refers to it among three sorts of achievement of trans-individuality. Wisdom is one of them. It is achieved through knowledge. The other two, one of them is heroism, and the other one is holiness. So I guess we can imagine the technology, the mechanologist, finding himself or herself a place in this vision of trans-individuality developed in the other work.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. That's really helpful. Yeah, I don't remember the sort of detailed development of those three relations to knowledge in the other work, but the idea of wisdom here, I think, is so he's contrasting that with so the wise man or the wise person. He's contrasting that with like a saint or a hero as other figures of sort of an exceptional human being. And so the wise person is a person that has a sort of practical knowledge, if I remember correctly. I'm not sure if I'm characterizing that correctly, but it's not the saint has a sort of initiatic knowledge or initiatic relationship to the trans individual, whereas the wise man has a more practical knowledge. I can't remember if that's correct or not, but I think that's a sort of association of the idea of the wise man. And I think he also, in that work, if I remember correctly, he characterizes the wise man or le sage in French as having to do with technical reality. Like he talks about Thales, for example. There's the famous story that Thales was able to calculate the occurrence of an eclipse, and that was sort of like a demonstration of his wisdom. And then he also was able to predict based on astronomical readings that there would be a certain kind of crop of olive crop, and he bought up the basically future shares. So like they had a sort of rudimentary futures market, so he was able to buy up shares in advance of the crop coming in, and so he took advantage of his knowledge in this practical way. And in a lot of different societies, you have sort of technical knowledge as a caste or a sort of exclusive form of knowledge that forms an exclusive body or a guild or something like that. Like I know in certain parts of Western Africa, iron workers or metal workers formed like a separate caste in pre-colonial times. And there was a sort of magical initiatic knowledge that the iron workers had. So I think he's sort of drawing on that as well. So the figure of the wise person is someone who has this sort of direct acquaintance with nature, with non-human reality, and they sort of stand outside of society because of that direct relationship to nature.
Yeah, and since you mentioned this metalworking, it perhaps the idea of wisdom also links back to encyclopedism discussed earlier in this work.
Right. Yeah, that would make sense. So he developed this sort of schema of different stages of encyclopedism, and it would seem um, uh, reasonable to try to associate this idea of wisdom with the notion of encyclopedism, because he argued in the earlier chapter, when he's talking about encyclopedism, that there is a new stage of encyclopedism that is sort of incipient in his time in the 1950s and 60s when he's writing. So it's not fully developed, but it's emerging around the notion of or around the field of cybernetics and some of the ideas about information and feedback and things like that. And so it would make sense that this role of the wisdom, the technical wisdom that he also sees as not having a social status yet, would be connected with this new form of encyclopedism that he argues is not yet fully developed either. So I think that makes sense to connect those two things. Okay, so I think we can go on to the next paragraph if someone would like to read.
Are y'all in the second paragraph?
Yes, a sketch of this role.
Okay. A sketch of this role can be found in Norbert Wiener's, is it Wiener or Wiener? Sorry,
Sorry. Yeah, I'm not sure how he pronounced it. I always pronounce it as Wiener. That's closer to the German pronunciation, but yeah, I don't know how he pronounced it.
Okay, fair enough. A sketch of this role can be found in Norbert Wiener's founding intention for cybernetics, the science of command and communication in the living being and the machine. The meaning of cybernetics has been poorly understood, for this eminently new endeavor has been reduced and judged according to old notions or tendencies. In France, cybernetic research, which makes the assumption that there is a unity between information theory and the study of command schemas and self-regulation, has split into two divergent branches, that of information theory with Louis de Broglie and the team publishing its work in the journal Revue de Optique, and that of researchers on automatism, with engineers like Albert du Croc representing the technicist and technocratic tendencies. But it is the connection between these two tendencies that would enable the discovery of the values implied in technical realities and their incorporation into culture. Information theory is indeed of a scientific order. It employs operational modes close to those employed by thermodynamic theory. Ducroc's technicism, on the contrary, seeks within the functioning of automatic machines the example of a certain number of functions that allow one to interpret other types of realities by analogy with automatism. In particular, the theory of the mechanisms of self-regulation allows us to sketch a hypothesis for explaining the origins of life. Or else it is the principal mental operations, or certain nervous functions that are explained by analogy in this way. Similar analogies, even when they are not arbitrary, in fact merely indicate that there are ways of functioning that are in common to both living things and machines. They leave the problem of the nature itself and of its ways of functioning untouched. This technicism is a phenomenology, rather than a deepening of the search for the nature of the schemas and conditions that govern their implementation.
Right, so here he brings in explicitly that idea of cybernetics that we were just discussing. Yeah, I think that confirms what we were saying about the relation of this technical wisdom to the new form of encyclopedism that he had discussed in the previous chapter. It's also worth pointing out here again that he's introducing the term values, which we saw quite a bit last week in the section we read. So he wants to, or he argues that we can only understand technical reality in connection with values, with the creation of values. Invention as a process of creating a new technical reality is also a process of creating a new value, something towards which that technical object functions. And so this is what distinguishes purely technical operation. So like the functioning of a machine, even a machine that has sort of built-in feedback mechanisms and self-regulation, it operates according to the sort of schema of operation, but it doesn't have the capacity to invent new values in the way that a human being does. So that's a distinction that he wants to draw between the living beings and technical objects.
It's interesting how he, the last sentence when he refers to phenomenology, um, because he is notably kind of eschewing the phenomenological approach that he is definitely very aware of, having studied uh, under phenomenologists, etc. So he's aware of this phenomenological approach, but is avoiding it throughout his work for the most part. And it's interesting that here I think there's a kind of explanation of why he is avoiding the phenomenological approach, which I hadn't really seen explicitly so far.
Right. It's interesting. It'd be interesting to study in more detail the relationship of his work to phenomenology and Merleau-Ponty in particular. But I think when he's using the term phenomenology here, I think he's using it in the sense that it's used in physics. So in a sense of just a study of appearances, I guess you could say. So rather than so, like for example, mechanics that just studies the laws of motion of objects, as opposed to dynamics, which would give an account of the forces underlying those laws of motion. So phenomenology meaning just a sort of providing a law that summarizes the motion of objects. So like celestial mechanics, for example, in the sort of I guess pre-Newtonian era, you could create laws for the motion of stars without having any sort of understanding or attempt to understand the forces that are behind those motions. So I think that's the type of study that he's pointing to with the term phenomenology. So he's arguing that this technicism, as he characterizes it, that looks at theories of self-regulation of machines, it only sort of gives schemas of functioning of the sort of appearances of these technical objects, but without giving a real understanding of the underlying forces or principles that govern how they come into being and how they're implemented and so on.
And I suppose he's impugning Ducrot. I'm not sure if that's how you pronounce that, but it's probably about right, right? Ducrot. He's impugning him on the basis of the kind of functional way that he explains these things, and he's reducing that to the kind of phenomenology, the sort of that there are these things there, and then they must be in this function. We see them, and they must function this way. Like the stars are out there, and they have these types of functions that are what does he call it? I guess he calls it interpretive. That allow one to interpret other types of realities by analogy. So it's just kind of an analogical function, I guess, which he relates to phenomenology, and I think that in physics and in other sciences, phenomenology is still used as a technical term for what you're indicating, actually.
Yeah. Again, I'm not sort of an expert on physics or anything by any stretch, but my understanding is that, that the phenomenology is used in that sense of giving an account of the appearances without having without making any claims about underlying reality that governs those appearances. And so that's what he's comparing this cybernetics in this technicist mode, where you just take the appearance of self-regulation in a machine and you make an analogy to living beings, or you relate living beings to that self-regulating automatism, but without having any, I guess, more fundamental mechanism or governing principle that explains how living beings come to be in the first place.
And I suppose there's going to be unity of these two divergent systems, right? Because this is what's necessary according to Simondon for the process of I don't know what it's necessary for, but just for getting things correct, I guess, about technology. It's necessary to put both of these perspectives together as like two sides.
Yeah, that's a sort of recurring pattern of argument in his work, I think, is that he shows that two different schools of thought or two different approaches to a subject matter have sort of a complementary understanding of it. They each grasp one aspect of it, but not the whole. And then he wants to provide sort of the median point out of which those two aspects can be developed. So it's not quite the same thing as like a compromise between the two or something along those lines, but it's the pre-individual point that is individuated into those two separate approaches or two different ways of understanding the subject matter. Okay, would someone like to read the next paragraph beginning, "It is of course possible"? Okay, well, if there's no volunteers, I can read it. It's a long one, so I don't blame you for hesitating. Okay. "It is of course possible not to accept the way Norbert Wiener characterizes information, and the essential postulate of this book, which consists, of his book, which consists in affirming that information is opposed to background noise in the same way that negative entropy is opposed to entropy as defined by thermodynamics. However, even if this opposition of a divergent determinism to a convergent determinism does not account for all of technical reality in its relation with life, this opposition contains within itself an entire method for the discovery and for the definition of a set of values that are implied in technical ways of functioning and in the concepts by means of which one can think them. But it is possible to prolong Norbert Wiener's reflection. At the end of his book, the author wonders how the concept he has defined might be used for the organization of society. Norbert Wiener observes that large groups contain less information than small groups, and he explains this fact by the tendency of the human elements that are the least homeostatic to occupy leading functions in large groups. According to Norbert Wiener, the quantity of information contained in a group would be, on the contrary, proportionate to the degree of perfection of the group's homeostasis. The fundamental moral and political problem would then consist in asking oneself how one can put individuals representing homeostatic functions at the heads of groups. But Norbert Wiener claims that none of the individuals who understand the value of homeostasis and who also understand information are capable of taking power, and all the cyberneticians together are confronted with men who preside over collective destinies, like mice that want to hang a bell around the cat's neck. The reference here is to Wiener's book Cybernetics. The forays made by the author among trade union leaders filled him with a bitterness that calls to mind Plato describing his disappointments in his 7th letter. And yet one can try to find a very different mediation between the understanding of technics and the force that governs human groups from the one Wiener contemplates. For it is difficult to make philosophers kings and kings philosophers. It often happens that philosophers who have become kings cease to be philosophers. The true mediation between technics and power cannot be individual. It can be realized only through the mediation of culture. For there is something that allows man to govern, the culture he has received. It is this culture that gives him significations and values. It is culture that governs man, even if this man in turn governs other men and machines. Now this culture is elaborated by the great mass of those who are governed. To the extent that the power exerted by a man does not strictly speaking come from himself, but crystallizes and concretizes in him. It comes from the governed men and it returns there. There is a sort of recurrence there. Right, so there's a lot in this paragraph. So a couple things that stood out reading through that. So Norbert Wiener, one of the founders of cybernetics, and he, I think, is credited with coming up with that name as well, the term cybernetics, based on the Greek word for a helmsman who steers a ship. But he also had a political engagement that is not quite as well known as his more strictly scientific work, because he was very concerned about the role of automation in labor relations, especially, and how it would replace workers and de-skill workers and give employers much more power over the workplace compared to workers. And so he actually wrote a letter to, I think it was the head of the AFL-CIO or some other union leaders, telling them about, how automation was coming and the effect it would have on the workplace and labor negotiations and so on. And he was very disappointed that the unions didn't really seem interested in engaging with his work and with this threat of automation. And so Simondon here compares that to Plato's seventh letter. So this is there's a series of letters that are attributed to Plato. I think most scholars today don't consider them to be authentic, written by Plato himself. Though I think the seventh letter is considered, it is like the most likely to be considered authentic in the scholarship. But this is the letter which it's written after Plato's, I guess, attempt to give counsel to the ruler of Syracuse. So Plato travels to Syracuse and serves as sort of like the court philosopher, I guess, or he tries to counsel the philosopher, counsel the ruler of Syracuse on how to implement like the ideal city in real life. And the attempt sort of ends in disaster, and Plato is apparently sold into slavery and has to be ransomed and rescued. So in the seventh letter, he's sort of disillusioned about the idea of trying to realize the ideal city on Earth. And so Simondon was comparing Wiener's sort of disillusionment with the unions to this type of disillusionment that Plato had.
Yeah, I thought that was really cool. That I mean, of course, he doesn't have to do these things like talk about Plato. It just kind of like some of the magic in his writing, I guess. The one thing I thought was really interesting in this paragraph was that the same way that human life was in a governance relation to technical objects, it seems like there's a governance relation of culture to the human lives as well, such that I think, I mean, it seemed like a fairly strong account of like a cultural realism. You know, that culture is an active force that causes. I guess, is it a causal factor? I'm not sure if that's how strong the claim he's making is, but it seems like formally, at least, the cultures are what is in a governance operation over a governance relation rather over humans and their operations of technology.
Yeah, I think cultural realism is a good term for what he's describing here, because he says the true mediation between technics and power cannot be individual. It can be realized only through the mediation of culture. So here he's I guess suggesting that even in the cases that Wiener is talking about, where, for example, in the workplace, how the introduction of automation gives the employer more power over the workers, even in this circumstance, it's not just the technical reality itself that allows for that power. It's the technical reality mediated through a culture in which, for example, certain people own machines and certain other people have to work on those machines. So it's only through that mediation of culture that exercise of power can take place. It's not a direct technical reality. Oh, and it's also interesting that he characterizes this governing role of culture, or this mediating role of culture, as a form of recurrence. So because culture is something that is produced by the mass, it's not just one. It's not the governing individual that can sort of introduce culture by decree or something like that. It's the whole mass of society has to be involved in the creation of culture. And that means that even the individual who governs or who has power over other individuals, they are themselves, in return, governed by the culture produced by the mass that they govern. So that's an interesting characterization of this recurrence relation that he's, I guess, borrowing from cybernetics and applying to the human realm.
Yeah, no, I didn't really pick up on that when I read that. That's really interesting.
And you can also point to he gives his favorite image of the crystallization again right at the bottom of 161. He's comparing the role of the individual who has the power over others or who governs others to the crystal in a supersaturated solution. So the power that the person exercises is crystallized in that person, but it's not that person themselves who it sort of produces the power or is the source of the power.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. I suppose that this type of power he's talking about is a kind of authoritative power rather than a kind of technical power, right? Or is it kind of supposed to be a univocal power, or just power?
Yeah, it sounds like he's referring to power in a sort of authoritative sense. So it's the power to exercise control over others or to govern other people's behavior. So I think like the manager of a factory or something like that is the idea that is sort of what he has in mind when he's talking about exercising power over others.
Somehow I can only feel comfortable reading this paragraph when I remind myself that when we use the word authority, we don't mean authority in the usual sense, and when we use the word culture, we might not be using the word culture in the usual sense as a basis of exclusion, right?
Can you expand a little bit on what that usual sense is that he's not using?
To start with authority, I think this passage is about culture, a relation to technical schemas giving one a certain authority. That is pretty much political. But it's not simply that, I guess. I think what he has his sights on is more properly creativity of a sort, a certain dynamism. And similarly for culture, for instance, when I hear the word culture in some sort of critical theory context, it's often, either you hear it in the context of a difference between nature and culture, or it is a certain distinction in the sense, for instance, a sociologist like Bourdieu gives it. There are certain attainments a certain class of people have, on the basis of which they can rule other people. This, the Marxist inspiration behind a certain idea of culture. I see a certain repurposing here, a deliberate repurposing of the words like authority and culture.
Yeah, that's I think helpful to clarify his use of the terms there. I think in general he uses the term culture throughout this book. He uses it. I think you're right in deliberately trying to take it from the realm of sort of literary culture or artistic culture or cultivation, which in French is often you often use the word culture to mean what we would say as cultivation in English, or the state of being cultivated. So I think he's sort of taking it from that realm and applying it to the technical reality because he wants to, or he wants us to recognize technical reality as a realm in which one can be cultured or uncultured in the same way as in the literary or artistic realm. So yeah, he's, I think, deliberately drawing on that word for that reason.
Okay, should I go ahead with the next paragraph?
Yeah, sounds good.
In a time when the development of techniques was poor, the elaboration of culture by governed men was enough for the government to think the problems of the group as a whole. Because it went from human group to human group via the government, the recurrence of causality and information was complete and accomplished. But this is no longer true. The basis of culture is still exclusively human. It is elaborated by the group of men. However, having gone through government, it returns and applies itself to the human group on the one hand and to machines on the other. Machines are ruled by a culture that has not been elaborated according to them, and from which they are absent. This culture is inadequate for them and does not represent them. If the totality of reality escapes the man who governs, then this is because the basis of this reality is still exclusively human. It is culture that is regulative and in which the circular link of causality between governing and governed consists. Its starting point and its fulfillment are the governed. The lack of social homeostasis comes from the fact that there is an aspect of governed reality that is not represented in this regulating relation that is culture.
Yeah, just a slight translation note here. So in the term that's translated government in the text here, in a couple sentences, it might be a little more precise to say the governing person or the governing. So where's that? The sentence. So about 3 lines down after the semicolon, because it went from human group to human group via the government. So there it should be something like the governing. So it's not so much the state or the process of governing, but the governing body. So the individuals who exercise governing over the rest of the human group.
Yeah, I found it very helpful as well to think of the function of well, to think of government as this relational claim rather than a claim about like a certain particular government or something like that. It's because there's a kind of, I guess it's um, a legal tradition of governance, I guess, which I was thinking of when he was talking about the government as this kind of a relational account of government. It reminds me a lot more of the legal concept of governance, rather.
Yeah, that might be a good way of expressing it. Yeah, so governance rather than government. Yeah, so the process rather than the entity. And this is also, again, something that he introduced in the introduction to the work, the idea of this governing relation, the drawing the governing schemas or the cultural schemas of governance from the technical reality, and the fact that technical or the sphere of the technical is something that is not included in the governing schema or the culture of governance. And why that leaves, by leaving that a certain aspect of human reality out of that sphere of governance, that means that you have this sort of abstract relationship or a lack of concreteness in that relationship, and so that you don't have the governance is not it can't fully govern human reality as a whole because it's leaving a certain aspect of that reality, namely technical reality, out of its schemas of governance.
And then this would not fulfill the social homeostatic criteria, which he mentioned in the last paragraph, I guess.
Right. Yeah, we didn't really elaborate on that point about homeostasis, and that's something that I'm a little bit, I'd say, wary of, or not quite convinced that homeostasis is the right term to use, because homeostasis implies a certain stability, I guess, of so like a homeostatic. I mean, the sort of classic example of a homeostatic device is the thermostat that if you set it to a certain temperature, say 22 degrees Celsius or whatever it is, and then it detects the temperature that's below that that temperature that you've set it to, then it turns on the heater, which then raises the temperature back to the temperature that you've set it to, and then it shuts off. So it's the homeostatic mechanism would tend to sort of preserve culture or society at a certain state. It would it has a sort of conservative function, and I wonder if that really is adequate to express the sort of governance of a social group, which seems to be much more I guess, dynamic. It's something that evolves over time as that group encounters different problems and obstacles, and dealings with other groups and natural realities and so on, which I think is hard to sort of bring into the frame of a homeostatic mechanism or homeostatic functioning.
I guess another key term in this context would be metastability, right? And I guess it could be useful to think of them side by side. Homeostasis is this secure, safe harbor from which one departs to undertake innovations, make discoveries through metastability. This relationship prone to disequilibriums. Homeostasis is equilibrium, I guess. A little like the relationship between deterritorialization and territoriality in Deleuze and Guattari, I'm thinking, but it's just tangential.
Yeah, that's an interesting suggestion. I think that would sort of fit with some of his other ideas. So characterizing metastability or characterizing social reality as metastable would that would be an aspect that has a certain stability in a sense that could be explained through these homeostatic functionings. And then at the same time, it's something that contains potentials for further development or invention, and transformation through time. So that makes sense, I think.
Yeah, I was searching through the text for his mentioning of metastability, and I still don't I'm not sure how to characterize it yet. I'm very familiar with metastability in the context of like the kind of Gestalt phenomenological kind of perspective of metastability, but I'm not sure if I know that's deeply phenomenological, and I'm sure that I have to describe metastability in a different way. Therefore, so I know that at some point he offers an account where metastable he uses metastability as an account for like an origin of life or something along those lines, I think in the early part of the book.
Yeah, it's not he doesn't develop it very much in this book, or not as much as in the individuation book, where it's one of his key concepts to understand the relationship between form and information. So metastability is a state is metastable if it contains potentials that can be developed, that can so it has a potentiality for transformation. It's not just stable in the sense of having the lowest state of energy. So it contains potential energy that can do work. So like a simple physical example is a ball at the top of the hill. So the ball might be in a metastable state because it's sitting at the top of the hill. It's not doing anything, but the fact that it's at the top of the hill means it has this potential energy that if you give it a slight push, it will roll down the hill, and it might roll for hundreds of meters or a long distance, it has this energy contained in its state. So that's a very simple example, but his favorite crystallization example is also an instance of metastability. So you have a supersaturated solution, which means there's all sorts of energy, potential energy contained in the atomic and molecular bonds in this chemical solution. And then once a germ crystal is introduced into the solution, or it can also sort of spontaneously form just by chance. Once that germ crystal is introduced, it's the fluid will crystallize around the germ crystal. So each layer of the liquid around the crystal will crystallize in a progressive transformation. So the fluid is in a metastable state that it has the potential for transformation, and then the germ crystal introduces the form which will, or sorry, the information that will allow that transformation to occur.
Okay, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It clears it up a little bit. It does very much still comport with the kind of phenomenological account of metastability as well.
Yeah, I was just going to say that I think he wants, the reason why he wants to introduce this notion of metastability is in part to account for those types of psychological processes, or yeah, I think he would characterize them as psychological rather than phenomenological. Yeah, so the operation of the Gestalt, as like the good form, or the form towards which perceptions are drawn, he compares this to the operation of the crystal that introduces the form to the supersaturated solution. So yeah, so it's a similar type of idea, but I think he wants to, I guess, give the foundation to this idea from sort of in the physical reality of energy and energy states. So he's sort of taking that as the foundation and then applying it to the field of psychological phenomena like Gestalt perception.
And I guess the corresponding general factor between both of these types of claims would be the stability that would be relevant for the kind of homeostasis that he's talking about in this paragraph, to kind of bring it back to the local conditions of where we're reading in the text right now.
Right. Yeah. So when he's talking about homeostasis, normally that has to do with stability rather than metastability. But it's possible that we can read this as maybe a broader sense of homeostasis that includes metastability as well, or so a homeostatic process that would mean maintaining a metastable state rather than maintaining a stable state. And then that would mean so that might fit a little bit better with his broader project, I guess you could say, which tends to recognize sort of this dynamical evolution through time as being an essential aspect of reality, rather than taking the stable state as being the essential aspect. Yeah, so with that said, I think we can go on to the next. So there's 2 paragraphs left in the section. So it looks like they're joined together, though. So I think I'll read both of them, unless, yeah, well, I'll start with the first one and we'll see where we get to. Therefore, the task of the technologist is to be the representative of the technical beings whereby culture is elaborated. Writers, artists, and very generally those so-called cynosures, I'm not sure about that word, but cynosures in psychosociology. This is not about mechanizing society through the integration of an adequate representation of technical realities to culture. There is no reason to consider society as an unconditional domain of homeostasis. Norbert Wiener appears to admit a postulate of values that is unnecessary, which is to say that a good homeostatic regulation is the ultimate purpose of societies, and the ideal that must animate every act of government. In fact, just as the living, le vivant, is grounded in homeostasis so as to develop itself and to continue its coming into being, rather than remaining perpetually in the same state, so too in the act of government there is a force of absolute advent, which is based on homeostases, but which surpasses them and makes use of them. The integration of a representation of technical realities into culture, through an elevation and enlargement of the technical domain, must put the problems of finality in their place as technical problems, which are wrongly considered ethical and sometimes religious problems. The incompleteness of techniques sacralizes the problem of finality and enslaves men with respect to ends that he represents to himself as absolutes. Yeah, actually, let's stop here because this sort of confirms what we were talking about with the metastability and stability. So what he had described in the last paragraph about homeostasis is he's attributing that conception to Wiener, and he's not sort of arguing for it himself, which was not entirely clear, I think, in that last paragraph. But he wants to relativize that in this next paragraph here. So the homeostasis as homeostatic regulation as a sort of basis for the living, but not exhaustive of the living reality. And in the same way, culture would have this sort of basis in homeostatic regulation, but would not be exhausted by homeostases.
He raises the problem of finality, and I think this shows that for him, the question of finality and homeostasis are related.
Yeah, I think homeostasis would have to generally be in relation to some sort of end, like the thermostat example. You have the end state of a certain temperature, which the homeostatic mechanism is regulating the whole system to achieve that end state. So I think homeostasis and ends are sort of coordinate concepts that accompany each other. But then he's also talking about society as a whole being directed towards certain ends, and he thinks, as far as I understand, he's presenting this as a problem. So an enslavement even is a pretty strong term. So so because technics is incomplete in this sense, that it enslaves men by setting these ends for society, that homeostatic mechanism would sort of keep society directed towards a fixed set of ends rather than allowing for sort of open transformation and development of society.
Yeah, I have been looking at a passage that says pretty much the same thing from earlier in the book. I think it's page 119, and this is also about finality and cybernetics relation to finality. He says, man overcomes enslavement by consciously organizing finality, just as he dominated the unfortunate necessity of work during the 18th century by rationalizing it, so as to render work efficient rather than suffering through it in resignation. So I guess this is, again, the encyclopedism chapter or section.
Yeah, thanks for finding that reference. That helps to clarify this. Yeah, so it's the idea that the ends are not fixed in advance. So human beings or society collectively can set its own ends, and they aren't sort of predetermined.
I'm really gonna have to go back and look over the whole book from the start again and just kind of do a quick read over of everything together, because there's definitely some stuff that has slipped my attention from earlier in the book that is extremely interesting. I'm just rereading the page 119 and 120 now.
Yeah, his I think his writing style is sort of it's a little bit slippery, I guess I would say, in a sense that you can read through something and it seems sort of straightforward, and then you get a few pages in, and then or even a chapter later, and you sort of look back at what he had said previously, and then you realize it's actually more I guess intricate than it seems at first glance. So it's like a lot of the work of reading, I think, is making those connections between different parts of the book, and sort of making one part clearer by drawing on an earlier or later part.
I definitely think that my attitude in coming into reading this book was a little bit too casual, and I should have been taking like a little bit more notes as things went along, because I really regret not having those anchors to go back to and think about what he was saying throughout the book as we're reading here. So before we get into the third section, the third part rather, I think I'm going to go through the whole book as of yet and just kind of refresh myself a little bit. We're reading it over like such a huge period of time as well, that I guess the function of human memory is limited in certain regards.
Right. It's been, I guess, probably a couple months now that we've been reading this book and some of the other texts that we looked at from Simondon. So yeah, of course, it's just natural that you forget certain elements. But I think, like most sort of classic books, I would count this book as a sort of minor classic. I think it repays rereading or going through it multiple times, because you pick up on elements that you didn't notice the first time through, or there's something that you find in part one of the book that makes more sense after having read part three, for example, or something along those lines. So you are capable of making all those connections the second time through that you didn't notice the first time through.
Or that you were just unprepared to commit to memory because you didn't understand the scope of the book, which is mainly my fault, my problem, I guess. I was thinking it was going to be a lot less in depth, but I mean, I was like, oh, I got this. Everything this will just be some technology stuff. It'll be fairly easy to understand, you know. That's kind of not going into this thinking this, and then realizing that he's talking about something which has its tentacles stretching out to all sorts of different philosophical questions and philosophical traditions, and it's um it's definitely not something that I would be comfortable at this point, like giving a summary of, for instance, because there's just so much more packed into here than I thought there was going to be.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. It's a little bit it sort of sneaks up on you. I would say it seems straightforward to start with, and then as you get along into it, you see sort of the density of concepts that he introduces, and the whole sort of network of all these concepts that fit together, and you have to grasp the whole network in order to be able to explain any one concept, which requires so you have to sort of know the whole before you know any part, but you can't know the parts, or sorry, you can't know the whole without knowing the parts. So you have to sort of go back and forth between the whole book and individual parts. So with that said, we can finish off this part of the book by reading the next paragraph, if someone would like to volunteer.
Would you like to read, Burke, or should I?
You could go 61.
For this reason, it is not only technical objects that need to be known at the level of what they currently are, but the technicity of these objects as a mode of relation of man with the world, among other modes such as the religious and the aesthetic. Taken on its own, technicity tends to become domineering and to answer each and every problem as it does today through the system of cybernetics. In fact, in order for it to be accurately known according to its essence and rightly integrated into culture, technicity must be known in its relation with the other modes of man's being in the world. No inductive study, starting from the plurality of technical objects, can discover the essence of technicity. It is therefore a direct examination of technicity according to a genetic method that must be attempted by employing a philosophical method.
Right, and this last paragraph is an introduction into the third part of the book, where he is going to provide this genetic account of the different forms of human relation to the world, and situating technicity as one of those relations. So that's what we're going to see in the third part of the book.
Yeah, I'm very much looking forward to this because I want to see the relation of technicity to the other modes of human interaction with the world, so to speak. That's something that's always been extremely curious to me, and definitely in explanations that I've given, people have been harsh critics of my framing of the technical in terms of philosophical questions, as though I've like seriously misunderstood it. So hopefully this will clear everything up. We'll get to the essence of technicity, and we'll be able to be rightly integrated into culture.
Yes, we'll solve all the problems after reading part 3 of this book, and everything will be fine after that.
Yep, I'm hoping so, at least.
But yeah, so more seriously, yeah. So the third part of the book, yeah. So it gives an account of the genesis of different modes of relation to the world. So magic, religion, science, and then technicity as one of those relations, and how they all sort of fit together. So it's not quite a historical account in the sense of sort of chronological history, but it's a genetic account, which I think is giving something a development, or sort of intellectual development, or a conceptual development of these different relations, one to the other.
And I'll have to be careful not to, since this is getting almost into the type of perspective that I'm used to talking about from studying Hegel. I'll try not to involve too much of my presuppositions about essence that I've derived from those readings and apply them in a kind of incoherent way to this text. Although I do have a hidden hope that Simondon is going to be like a Hegelian in some way. Yeah, I mean there is a certain sense in which the striving towards the type of mediation that he does seems to be in the Hegelian spirit, at least, of dialectical unity and those sort of things. So, but I'll try not to make that reading too predominant in my perspective as we go on to the third part.
Yeah, I mean, it would be interesting to make that comparison as well. Like if because there are certain passages, I think more in the individuation book, where he gives a sort of he situates himself in relation to dialectics in a sort of critical way. So he in particular he rejects the idea of a negative moment in the development of that mediation and of the process of transduction. So for example, the example that he uses in a number of different occasions of the integration of disparate retinal images into a visual field or a visual world with 3 dimensions. So inventing that third dimension of depth by integrating the difference between the 2 retinal images. So he rejects the idea that the difference between the images is a form of negation or contradiction in the sort of Hegelian sense. So he sort of situates himself in relation to dialectics, but also in a critical way. So he rejects certain elements of it. And it would be interesting to look at this third part of the book and see to what extent it fits a Hegelian model of dialectics, and to what extent it differs from that model, and sort of how they fit together. That would be something interesting to look at.
Yeah, definitely. Although I still am gonna have to be careful because I'm biased to over elaborate those types of things, especially when it comes to Hegel, and especially when it comes to Hegel and essence. So.
Okay, fair enough. So because today was a fairly short reading, I thought maybe we could just take a quick look back at what we did in part 2 of the book before we go on to part 1. So and we've done that a little bit through like in the readings today. So the sort of key concepts that I wanted to come back to was that idea of encyclopedism, which was something that in the first chapter of this part was one of the key concepts that he introduced. So the idea of different modes of relation to techniques and encyclopedism as sort of going through these different stages that integrate. So the development of technical reality itself and the development of the cultural appropriation of that technical reality sort of proceed in tandem. So you have early modern encyclopedism or Renaissance encyclopedism, and then you have in the 19th century you have a form of encyclopedism which accompanies thermodynamic machines, and then you have this new encyclopedism which is sort of developing in his time as he sees it, which uses notions of from cybernetics like information and feedback, so he's calling for this form of encyclopedism to be further developed. And then, as we saw in the last chapter, in chapter 2, that relationship that accompanies the new form of encyclopedism would be a relationship where the human is not sort of dominant over the machine or subordinated to the machine, but there's a sort of symmetrical relationship, and the human has actually, he even uses the word responsibility and ethical vocabulary talking about the machine. So yeah, there's an ethical relationship to technical reality and responsibility, and a relation to values in the sphere of the technical, which is sort of particular to his work. We don't normally associate ethical relationships or responsibility with technical reality, but that's another key concept that he introduced in this part of the work. I don't know if there's any other sort of important concepts that anyone else would like to point back to from part 2. I know it's been a while as we missed a couple weeks as well, so it's we have to look back, a month or 6 weeks to some of the early parts of the part 1, or sorry, part 2.
I would really love to, but I feel like I need to go back and kind of integrate everything in part 2 to really get a clear and concise picture.
Yeah, no, that's okay. So we're at about an hour and 10 minutes, an hour and 15 minutes or so into our talk for today. So I think we can probably end here, have a shorter session today, since we have a little bit fewer people than usual. And we had a short reading for today, and then we can start part 3 next time.
Yeah, hopefully Lion will come and tell us the real deal on Simondon.
Yeah, that would be great. Someone who's been working on Simondon for their thesis, apparently. That would be great to have more input from them next time if they are willing and able. All right, so thank you, everyone, and thank you again to 61 for editing and posting the recordings, which we can all find on YouTube. So I'm just going to end the recording, and I'll see you next week.
Thank you both.
Thanks, everyone. See you next week.